I'm also going to, I think, pick up from just one of the last points that Etnibi made in his recommendations, and that's the role of civil society in terms of accountability. And this is the presentation I'm going to give is slightly different to the sort of presentation I normally give, which is much more around quantitative research. But what I'm going to do is describe a process that's just wrapped up in South Africa. And I'm going to talk about it because I think it's a hugely valuable exercise. We don't have any real outcomes in terms of we'll see what the long-term outcomes are, but the mechanisms being repeated in other provinces, and it certainly holds potential for citizenry to hold the state and police accountable in the failure of other systems. So, sort of amongst the slides that I dropped at lunchtime were slides around trust and legitimacy and policing by consent, but I'm just decided to leave this and an extract from the International Police Standards UN guidebook. Just to say, obviously, things we all know, public trust and confidence in the police are prerequisites for effective policing, and perhaps just to say this is obviously more of an issue, well, not more of an issue, it's possibly more challenging in post-conflict societies and new democracies, not least because the police are often associated with previously oppressive regimes, and so there's sort of all sorts of issues there. Democratic policing requires that the police simultaneously stand outside of politics and protect democratic political activities and processes. Again, I think thinking back to the first presentation, some of the speeches this morning, that's obviously got lots of resonance. And finally, when intervening in conflicts, the police must be guided by the principle that everyone shall be subject to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others. So that's really just the departure point for what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not sure if anybody knows anything, well, how much people know about South Africa, I'm sure everybody. But post-apartheid, we developed a relatively sound, robust institutional and legislative framework for policing. Dixon, in writing about accountability in South Africa, referred to all sorts of mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, legal, political, legislative, for example, and in South Africa, we had institutions such as what was the Independent Complaints Directorate, has now been renamed recently as the Independent Police Investigations Directorate. Section 9 institutions, things like the Human Rights Commission, Gender Commission, etc. And then I think importantly, and what had lots of potential in South Africa, was the Civilian Secretariat of Police. And it was set up initially under our Ministry of Safety and Security, and subsequently it fell within our essentially our police ministry, reporting to the Minister of Police, financial accountability to the Minister of Police. And one of the intentions of the Civilian Secretariat of Police was to look at police oversight and accountability, and also build the trust between policing and or the police and the community, in inverted commas. And so while it was set up as a potentially powerful institution, just by virtue of where it was located, and its sort of lack of independence didn't really have the teeth, and it's been, the position's been downgraded subsequently from sort of Director General level to Deputy Director General, where it's been for the last few years. But then Dixon also spoke about the intimacy of the sort of organic mechanism. So the intimacy that programs of visible police are intended to foster between police on a permanent assignment, sector and community. Basically, community police relations, sort of community policing structures, community policing forums, etc. Community policing was rolled out in South Africa immediately post-apartheid. By 98, we were already instituting community policing. Theoretically, every police precinct should have a community police forum. Various evaluations that have been done, however, have shown them to be largely ineffective for various reasons, highly politicized, all sorts of reasons there. And he just carried on from that police and this, I think, reflects a whole bunch of writings. Police and community collectively identify problems and seek appropriate solutions, thus achieving a rough congruence between the values and priorities of police and people at a neighborhood level. So how does that translate to Khayelitsha? Khayelitsha is a township outside of Cape Town. It's got a population of approximately 400 to 450,000. Just over 50,000 of those inhabitants live in brick houses. All the rest are essentially informal
constructions.
Thank you. 28% of the population are between the ages of 0 and 14. 68% are between 15 and 59. So a relatively young population. More than 50% of the population in Khayelitsha have not completed secondary schooling, and unemployment rates of 38%. So it's pretty characteristic of the inequalities and the sort of social divide that exists within South Africa. In fact, I think it's one of the best examples that we actually have in South Africa of those inequalities. Now, whether or not this can be expected, I'm sure it can be debated, but this gives you an idea of what some of the sort of crime stats are in South Africa. Khayelitsha as a police precinct, has the second highest murder rate in the country, an average of 286 murders per. That can't be right. There'll be 286 murders. Yeah, it is per 100,000. So rate represented 28.8% increase during the financial years from 2011 to 2012. And that bucks the national trend. Our murder rate had been coming down until 2010, 2011. And Khayelitsha has just gone in the totally opposite direction. Interestingly, in South Africa, despite me saying that the rate's gone up for 2 years in a row, over 10 years, our murder rates have dropped. Despite that, the Khayelitsha stations also have the lowest police to population ratio in the whole of the Western Cape province. To give you an idea, that graph on the top there is it's data that is SAPS data, but it is not the official SAPS reported data. This came out subsequently during the commission that I'm going to talk about. But you can see there that Greater Khayelitsha had 354 murders during the previous, I think it was 2012, 2013. The bottom slide there, 617 sexual offences during the preceding year. So it gives you an idea of the levels of violence within Khayelitsha. In large response, due to dissatisfaction with policing and what's perceived as a lack of police trust, accountability, legitimacy, all those reasons there, Khayelitsha also has one of the highest levels of vigilantism in South Africa. A 2006 study, which is now extremely dated, but it's also the last study that we had looking specifically at vigilantism in Khayelitsha, basically showed that the vigilantism that was happening was a response to slow reaction time to complaints, weak statement taken, poor detective work, evidence gathering, no follow-up on cases, no communication between the detectives and the community, and corruption. So it's the normal sort of breakdown in police relations and response, I think, and dissatisfaction with the police response that's led to the levels of vigilantism that we have in Khayelitsha. And I think during 2013, there were over 40 or 50 vigilante killings alone in Khayelitsha, which I think is an extraordinarily high number. I just want to contextualize this within a broader dialogue that's been had or has existed within the past 2 or 3 years as well. Despite the fact that we had great progressive crime and violence prevention policy, a progressive policing policy, I'm sure many of you will know, in 1999 that was to a large degree abandoned with the change in government. And this is a statement that was made in 2008 by our then Deputy Minister of Police to the police. You must kill the bastards if they threaten you or the community. You must not worry about the regulations. I want no warning shots. You have one shot and it must be a kill shot. I want to assure policemen and women that they have permission to kill these criminals. I will not tolerate any pathetic excuses for you not being able to deal with crime. You have been given guns, now use them. And this is the message, to a large degree, that the police were getting. Despite the fact that there were major challenges to changes in legislation that were happening, this led to a long debate and various constitutional challenge to Section 29 in our Police Act, which speaks specifically to shoot to kill. And so I think what we see is in South Africa, we've been seeing police under threat in what we perceive as ineffective police and police that can't be trusted, that are corrupt and that are not responsive. But the police are also faced with these kind of conflicting messages what the policy and legislation actually says, yet a sort of shift towards remilitarization in the police, and messages like this from the Deputy Minister of Police. So I guess my point is just we have conflicting messages from different sources that the police are sort of working within. To look at some data, relatively recent data, that gives you an idea of sort of what's happening within the police to some degree. In 2001, 2002, a total of 416 brutality-related criminal cases were opened against the police. 2 years ago, that had increased to 1,722 cases, so an increase of 313%. On average, 5 cases per day being opened of police brutality. In 2012, SAPS charged over 1,000 of their own officials with corruption-related offences. And this, I think, reflects very much what was put forward in the previous two surveys, two presentations. 66% of the adult population think the police are corrupt, 41% don't trust the police, and 35% report being scared of the police. That's all data from national surveys. Trust in the police is a lack of, 83% of the population in Khayelitsha do not trust the police. So your rates of trust in Khayelitsha specifically are much, much lower than your national figures. And I mean, that's, I think, it speaks for itself at a national level as well. So that's where the police are. In 2012, civil society in Khayelitsha, a group of organizations decided to call on our provincial leadership to institute a commission of inquiry against the breakdown of relations between the police and the community. It wasn't focused on police corruption. It wasn't a commission of inquiry into police mismanagement or non-performance, but they phrased it specifically in terms of a breakdown of relations between the police and the community. One of the motivations for that was the widespread inefficiencies, apathy, incompetence, and systemic failures of policing. The call for commission of inquiry is policing is a national competency in South Africa, but there are certain responsibilities and oversight responsibilities devolved to a provincial level. And this is just an excerpt from our constitution that speaks directly to that. It basically says that cabinet is responsible for policing. But it also says, if you look at point 3 there, each province is entitled to monitor police conduct, to oversee the effectiveness and efficiency of police services, to promote good relationships between the police and the community, to assess the effectiveness of visible policing, and to liaise with cabinet members responsible for policing. It's a very clear role of the province in terms of police oversight and the relationship between the police and the community. Also from the Constitution, in order to perform the functions set out in the previous subsection, a province may investigate or appoint a commission of inquiry into any complaints of police inefficiency or breakdown of relations between the police and the community. And the commission must then make recommendations to the cabinet member responsible for policing. Despite this very clear mandate in our Constitution for the role of provinces and for the space to establish a commission of inquiry, the Premier of the province was challenged by our national government and by the police, by the Minister of Police, and was taken up to the Constitutional Court level. The Minister of Police said that this is not a provincial competency, and this is purely a matter for police, and we're not accountable to anybody else. After about a year of stalling, the Constitutional Court unanimously found in favour of the province, and so in 2013, this Commission of Inquiry was established. And I think very strategically, there were two commissioners appointed. The one was Vusi Bukoli, who's the ex-head of the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa. The other was Justice Cato Reardon, who's a ex-Constitutional Court judge. And I think they were also very strategic in how they set out the objectives of the commission, because they made it very clear from the start that it was not, and this is a direct quote from their mandate, not to assign liability, guilt or blame to any one person or institution, but rather to investigate the concerns and complaints and provide concrete recommendations for addressing concerns. And I think this was strategically done simply because it tried to present the commission as less intimidating and threatening to the police. What was interesting is that despite the challenge to the setting up of the commission by the Minister of Police, and the Civilian Secretariat of Police supported the minister in trying to block that. Once the Constitutional Court ruling came, the entire thinking of the police actually shifted. And there was much more cooperation and support for the commission. And while there was lots of stuff that came out during obviously during the hearings, there was a fundamental shift in thinking from the police. And I think a lot of it was due to the way that the commission was actually framed by the commissioners. During the process of the commission, they heard evidence from, 87 witnesses. They received statements from 170 complainants. They called on 40 experts. They commissioned some specific research to be undertaken. We looked at work, our organisation looked at work around youth perceptions of the police. They undertook numerous site visits, and they reviewed over 50,000 pages of documentation. So it was a very, very comprehensive process. Some of the key findings that came out of that. There's a 580-page report that was launched literally a month ago. So it's a very, very new, as I say, that's why it's really hard to see what the outcomes are yet. Some of the key findings acknowledge that Khayelitsha is an extremely difficult place to police. And this was a key argument by the police, is that because of the informal nature, because of the environmental design aspects, because of the sort of lack of trust in the police, we don't have the space, we don't have we're not able to adequately do our jobs. And the Commission recognised that. They recognised that Khayelitsha was a very difficult space to police. They recognised the context and geographic specifics, realities. They looked at the systemic failings of the whole criminal sort of prevention system. So they looked at the failings of the social development system, at the education system. They looked at resource constraints, and they recognized that the perception that the police were faced with the perception, or many of the police felt that they were under siege, that was an exact phrase that came out repeatedly by the police, that they're doing their job under siege. Having said that, they also identified various deficiencies, operational deficiencies, things like no operational patrols, no hotspot policing, simply non-responsiveness of police to take calls, and that was something that came out repeatedly in the research that we were commissioned to do around schools and youth, is that police didn't respond when principals or schools called them to deal with violence. Inadequate detective work. Only 1% of cases resulted in conviction from Khayelitsha. They identified management deficiencies, things like lack of prioritization of crimes or geographical locations, resource management, HR management, dysfunctional specialized units. Critical because some of the evidence that came forward around sexual violence and violence against children was I think, quite horrific. And yet the family and child and sexual offences unit in Khayelitsha was to a large degree dysfunctional. And then they identified the breakdown in relations. What is also critical is that they didn't see this breakdown in relations as being absolute and irredeemable. But they identified potential for that relationship to be rebuilt. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I think these just give you an idea of some of the some of the recommendations that came out. At a station level, adopt a community policing commitment in consultation with local residents. Start again from scratch to build the relationship between community police forums and the community, and to build the relationship between the police stations and the community. Adopt a procedural justice mode of policing. Establishment of a monitoring and oversight team to ensure efficiencies at the station, or that inefficiencies are addressed. Urgent change management by the SAP's leadership, urgent strategic review of detective services, the Provincial Commissioner to issue guidelines for visible policing and informal settlements, something that we actually don't currently have in South Africa. A revision of the human resource plan. Looking at a station-level performance chart, recording and responding to vigilantism. And this was something that came out very strongly in the Commission as well, is that most vigilante killings were not actually recorded as such by the police. And there were numerous cases of the police being present at vigilante killings and just watching, not actually getting involved. Specialized training on domestic violence for the specialized units, improved research partnerships, and this I think also has been mentioned, and there have been some great specific recommendations under this, looking at longitudinal studies of the response of the police to domestic violence in Khayelitsha, and there are already sort of concepts being set up around that. looking at improved governance and oversight mechanisms from a formal, from sort of the formal system. And then various other sort of sub-recommendations. We're looking at community safety forums, the release and availability of crime statistics, so that the community was aware of what was going on. That they saw the official recording of what was going on, and the introduction of things like conflict mediation in Khayelitsha, supported by the police as well. So these are the sort of very broad recommendations, and I think they're quite comprehensive. They look at institutional reform, they look at rebuilding trust, they look at the role of the community as well, and they're quite strong on sort of what the role of the community is. Some of our local, the Commission report's been called one of the most important documents on police and public safety in South Africa over the course of the last 20 years. These are two quotes that have come out of the Institute of Criminology at UCT. On its depth of investigation report and sensibility of recommendations, the report is likely to become a classic of its kind. And I guess the last point to make is simply this was a long process. It took between 2 and 3 years from start to finish. It went through it went through the constitutional challenge. It garnered a lot of press, mostly negative. But what's happening now is civil society is using this model to replicate the process in other provinces as well. And because of the process that the Western Cape, the Khayelitsha Commission's been through, it's being done on a much more, it's being done in partnership with the police and being done in partnership with the provinces, rather than being seen as, civil society being adversarial towards the police. And I think there's some important lessons there that can come out as well. I think I will leave it there. It's a broad overview.